Good evening, everyone. See, some folks are still making their way to the seat. I'm glad to see we have a packed house tonight. Don't have a full head count yet, but it's so great whenever you have discussions like this that are impacting a community like here in the tri-state. It's important to have those extra set of ears. And how many of you, if I can ask quickly, by the way, my name is Craig McKee from WCPO 9 on your side, and we're dedicated to covering the issues of heroin and the opiate addiction, the epidemic happening here in the tri-state and across the country. And we are trying to keep that dialogue open, and that's why we wanted to also be a part of this event tonight at NKU. So if I can, show of hands here, how many people have been impacted by heroin, either directly or a family member here in the tri-state? Look to your left and look to your right. That's a lot of hands. That's a lot of hands. And by having these conversations, perhaps we can start a dialogue. We can get that conversation that somebody didn't think that, really, that's how heroin gets into our community? That's how you're able to buy it? How easily you're able to get your hands on it? There are so many different levels to this conversation, and tonight we hope to touch on everything from the current status here in the tri-state. Are things working? Are they not working? And Sam's book, how many people have had a chance to read Sam's book yet? It's pretty eye-opening, isn't it? I've read a lot about heroin, and of course, in our business, we cover the unfortunate impact from drugs in our community. And there were things in this book, I really shook my head, and I was like, really? This is how this is happening? The fact that they've been able to change the model on how they get drugs into our community. It used to be kind of the dealer on the street corner and this and that, but when you're talking about an entire business, they changed the business model of what drug dealers are and how they act. And it's that cat and mouse game, but we're here to hopefully give you the information during this discussion and keep that dialogue going where those mice that are in our community can be trapped and we can get them out of our community. Again, there are a number of people that are going to be talking tonight, of course, including President Jeffrey Mearns from NKU. He's been president here since August of 2012. In that time, he's been able to welcome the most academically prepared students in NKU's history here to campus, while also overseeing the expansion of the campus, including the new Health Innovation Center, which, of course, he's going to tell you a little bit more about right now. Please welcome President Jeffrey Mearns.
Thank you, Craig, and good evening. It's a privilege to serve as the president of Northern Kentucky University, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here to this very special evening. And it's a special privilege to welcome our guest speaker, Sam Quinones. Sam, as you know, is visiting our campus, and he's helping our region to learn more about a very important public health crisis that is afflicting our community. You know, here at NKU, at our university, we are a leader in health innovation. We bring our community together to examine and to discuss critical issues like the heroin epidemic. And we aspire to help the community come together to solve that problem, to solve the problem for our community, our region, and our country. Our hope is that tonight's event will serve as a catalyst for a deeper understanding of this epidemic, and that we'll have other events as part of Sam's visit, including a think tank event in our College of Education and Human Services tomorrow. For far too long, our community has suffered the devastating effects of heroin. Those effects include the loss of loved ones and the extraordinary strain this epidemic has placed on our healthcare systems and our economy. A study released in January, I know just a moment ago you were asked to raise your hand if you knew someone who had died as a result of this epidemic. Well, a study released in January revealed that 35% of the people here in Northern Kentucky know someone who has used heroin. And that figure is higher than the rest of Kentucky, and it is higher than the number in Southwest Ohio. A year-end report by St. Elizabeth's Healthcare indicated that their emergency room staff last year reversed more than 1,100 heroin overdoses in 1 year. That's 3 a day. And that number represents a 57% increase compared to 2014. So across our region, teams of public safety workers, public health experts, and concerned citizens are working day and night to confront this epidemic. Most recently, the city of Fort Thomas created a heroin interdiction team that patrols I-471 in Campbell County. That's the main traffic artery that leads to our campus. In just the first month, this team made 70 opiate-related arrests. The offenders ranged in age from 21 to 56. And this statistic illustrates an important point. Heroin doesn't discriminate. It kills indiscriminately. It kills irrespective of age and race and religion and socioeconomic class. And so here in northern Kentucky, we must work together as a community, as a region, in order to defeat this heroin epidemic. And we are working together here at NKU. We are working to galvanize a region to address public health issues. And that is one of the founding principles of our Health Innovation Center. We broke ground last fall on this facility that will allow us to grow our existing program and to create new ones, including a new program in addiction science. All of these programs will improve the health of the people in our community and reduce the amount we spend on health care. And the heroin epidemic is a perfect illustration of the region's need for this type of academic and community programming. As the work continues on the development of the center and the refinement of our health professions programs, our goal will be to prepare students to work in the 21st century's multidimensional public health and healthcare fields. Real solutions. That's what we aspire to help. Real solutions to our heroin epidemic and countless other health challenges facing our region, our Commonwealth, and our nation. They will come as a result of cross-functional collaborations. These collaborations will engage the full range of knowledge, and they will break down the silos that isolate expertise. Now, this work requires strong partnerships across the community, like the partnership that we have with our colleagues at St. Elizabeth Healthcare. Just last fall, as you may know, St. Elizabeth's committed to invest $8 million to help us design, construct, and equip a 2-story high-tech simulation center that will now be called the St. Elizabeth Healthcare Simulation Center in our Health Innovation Center. And I want to thank our colleagues, our friends, our partners at St. Elizabeth for that extraordinary investment in our partnership. And Garen Colvin, would you please stand, the CEO of St. Elizabeth. It is those kind of collaborative investments and partnerships that are critical to the success of our community. Thank you, Garen. The Health Innovation Center, as I said, will be a catalyst that allows our university and our partners to lead frank and important community discussions about our health challenges. This series on heroin is just the beginning of something greater, something truly special, and we are excited about being and playing an important role in that important future. So again, thank you for joining us for this very special event, and now Craig will introduce our keynote speaker. Thank you all very much.
It's my pleasure tonight to introduce Sam Quinones. Sam is a journalist and author of 3 acclaimed books, including Dreamland, The True Tale of America's Opiate Epidemic. Sam's career as a journalist has spanned 3 decades. He lived for 10 years as a freelance writer down in Mexico, in fact, where he wrote his first 2 books. In 2004, he returned to the United States to work for the LA Times, covering immigration, drug trafficking, and gangs. He now works as a freelance reporter, writing for National Geographic, Pacific Standard Magazine, the New York Times, Los Angeles Magazine, and other publications. Dreamland has been named one of Amazon's best books of 2015 and is on many people's favorites list for this last year, including Kentucky Governor Matt Bevin and Michael Botticelli, director of the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy. Last month, Dreamland won the National Book Critics Circle Award for general nonfiction. This book explores, of course, the addiction issue and how it's devastated Portsmouth, Ohio, and hundreds of small rural towns and suburbs across America. It shines a bright light on the challenge our region faces. We are honored to have him with us this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Sam Quinones.
All right. How you guys doing? Good? All right. That's good. It is so great to be here in Northern Kentucky again. Been here 3 times. In fact, I started the book here. If those of you may have read it, remember this weird scene where I happened on New Year's Day in 2013, I guess by that. And I was looking for a place to eat, and everything was shut down, and it was snowing, and I really don't know how to drive in the snow very well. So I figured it best to stop, and I stopped into Herb and Thelma's Diner, or Tavern over here. I can't even remember where it was, actually. It's in Covington. I completely lost bearings, and there I meet a wonderful woman named Carol Wagner, who, as I was having chili, told me the story of how her son died of heroin. I could not believe how you could throw a dart at a map and come into a tavern out of the middle of nowhere and find a story of how someone died of heroin overdose in Kentucky. To me, that was a stunning thing. And at the time, I had just come from Indiana visiting in-laws, and they were wondering why the hell I was writing a book about this, because there's no problem. And in fact, one sister-in-law wanted to know, what exactly is heroin? I don't really know what that is, you know. And I began to say, well, I explained it to her, but really kind of left there feeling like, oh my God, am I signed me and my family up for some kind of crazy idea of writing a book that a problem doesn't exist? And then I just happened into that tavern, and it was not too far from here. I'd never forget that. I was wearing my big Berkeley sweatshirt. And she says, well, you're not from here, are you? And I said, no, ma'am, I'm not. I'm from California, if you couldn't tell. And why are you here? Well, I'm writing about heroin, and that shut the whole party down. There was a birthday party for her little granddaughter, I think. And I'll never forget that day. I told my wife about it. I was driving home, driving away from that, going, honey, you're just not going to believe what just happened. And it was kind of where this book started. So I think tonight, first of all, let me say thank you to the folks who have helped so much in organizing this. President Burns, he's not here anymore, but there he is. There you go. Thank you very, very much to the Provost's office. Thanks a million for this, to St. Elizabeth's, and especially to Sue Ott Rollins, wherever she is. Can't find, there she is, okay. For calling me, I guess it was Joel Robinson who called me about a year ago now, almost, and wondered about this possibility. And so I thank you all for putting this all together. As you'll see from this talk, I believe this kind of community thing is extraordinarily important in combating this problem. So tonight, I guess what I'd like to do is just tell you a little bit about my story and this book, and how this all came to be, how this guy from L.A. Ends up in northern Kentucky with a book about heroin in the heartland. And it really begins in 2009. I had lived 10 years in Mexico, written 2 books there, but came back in 2004. The drug war kicks off in about 2005, roughly. And a few years later, they put me on a team of reporters to write about about the drug war. My job was to write about how drugs were trafficked once they crossed the border, which was an excellent idea. One day, I happened to be tooling around the internet, and I found a series of stories about, excuse me, overdoses, fatal overdoses in Huntington, West Virginia, from black tar heroin. Now, I came to that story with a lot of background. I had been a crime reporter in Stockton, California, which is a real good place, by the way, to be a crime reporter if you want to be one. There I had learned about black tar. Now, I had grown up in the 70s, And I had seen all the great heroin movies, like Serpico and French Connection 1 and 2 and all those movies. Just loved them. And the heroin was always white. So I was like, what is black tar heroin? But was the only heroin they had in Stockton. And a narcotics officer took me aside and taught me all about it. Said, no, this is the only kind of heroin we have on the western side of the United States. You don't find it on the east of the Mississippi, but it's all over here, and it only comes from Mexico. In this hemisphere, black tar is only made in Mexico. So my question was, what is black tar heroin doing in quantities sufficient to kill a dozen people in Huntington, West Virginia in a period of about 6 months when they only had one fatal heroin overdose in 10 years? And what is a Mexican drug doing in a state that I did not associate with heroin, and in fact a state that has no Mexicans? Right? So these were questions, and if you're a reporter and you don't act on these kinds of questions, then you probably should find another job. And I didn't want another job, so I decided, well, I called Huntington PD. Huntington PD says, no, all that heroin comes from Columbus. I said, okay. So I call up Columbus. I call the DEA in Columbus, bless his heart, a very valuable, generous DEA agent, supervisor, answers the phone, and what's more, he's mad. It's a good state of mind to find a DEA agent because he'll tell you anything at that point. And he says to me, 10 years ago, I asked him about all this black tar and stuff. He says, 10 years ago, we had no heroin in Columbus, none, zero. Then we began to see this weird thing happen. We began to see all these Mexican kids driving around in old, like, Nissans with their mouths filled with tenth of a gram doses of heroin wrapped in balloons. They kept a big bottle right next to them of water, so the cops pulled them over. They just swig it all down. And they were dispatched. They were selling heroin like pizza. They had an operator standing by. The addict would call this number at the operator standing by, would dispatch the driver to wherever the addict was, and a binational drug deal would ensue with the guy spitting out 5, 6, 8 balloons, whatever the addict wanted, usually in some parking lot, a Burger King parking lot, a Target parking lot, whatever it happened to be. The crazy thing is, he said, they pay these guys a salary. I've never seen a narcotics trafficking network pay a salary of $500 a week. They don't use guns. Now, I had come from Stockton covering the crack epidemic where only guns were used. I mean, that's how you got market share, was you killed everybody around you on your street corner. That's really how it worked. It was very, very, very violent thing. He said, no violence. These guys don't use guns. They're completely quiet. That's part of their business plan. They go from 7 in the morning, 7 at night. They stop working at 7 p.m. because they don't want the cops to be following them. They want to be able to see any cops that are following them. And they dress like day laborers in front of Home Depot. So all of this just sounded great. I was like, wow, okay, this is a great story. Columbus, Ohio has some kind of weird pizza delivery system. That is amazing. Then he said something that pretty much changed my life for the next few years. He said, the crazy thing is, they're all from the same town. Now, I lived in Mexico a long time. I'd traveled all over the country, and I knew that the towns all over Mexico, you can find towns all over Mexico where everybody does the same job, and the reason for that is because there is no education system really accessible to working-class people that allows you to go from being a mechanic or a peasant farmer to a mechanical engineer or a lawyer. So you get your trade from those people around you. If everybody in your town is a construction worker, you're a construction worker. The biggest example of that really is just immigrant villages. One person immigrates to Dallas and becomes a landscaper. Pretty soon most of the town's a landscaper in Dallas. I wrote in my first book about a town where everybody makes popsicles for a living. It's one of the great business stories of Mexico. They've taken this popsicle business model and taken it all across Mexico, and it's really a magnificent thing. And they have built, in front of their town, they have built an enormous a 2-story concrete popsicle in honor of the popsicle. There's another town where everyone's a pimp. Everyone is a pimp. Literally, everyone's a pimp. They take they trick out these innocent little girls, the country girls, and they pimp them to Queens, New York. True story. So I was ready to hear that there would be this town. There is a town out there, I thought, where everybody traffics heroin like pizza into Columbus, Ohio. I thought, yeah, that is a story right there. And then I ask him, which town is this? He gets back on the phone. He gets a little conference with his case agent that gets back on the phone. He says, Tepic. Now, right then I knew he was wrong. He wasn't giving me a lie. It just was wrong. That Tepic is a big city. It's the capital of the state, of a small state called Nayarit. But it's 350,000 people. And these stories happen in small villages where a lot is denied people, where a lot is limited. And I had this hunch that there was a small town out there that was a major supplier of heroin, selling it like retail, like pizza, in Columbus, Ohio. I just had to find out which one. He told me, our problem is we arrest these guys and arrest these guys and arrest these guys, and they send up new guys every 3 days later, they got new guys working. So I took a list of people he had indicted federally, went to the Bureau of Prison website and found most of them and wrote to them, like 15 of them, in Spanish, saying, hey, you want to talk about your pizza delivery system? And for a month, I heard nothing. Not one thing. And then, bless his heart, a guy calls, and he tells me, he's a guy who was an operator in a Columbus heroin crew. He tells me, yep, we're not from Tepic. We're from a town called Jalisco. And if you know Mexico, you know there's an enormous state called Jalisco, where Guadalajara is located. But this was a small town, and it's called Jalisco. They spelled it with an X instead of a J, as the state is spelled it. So I began to listen to this guy. He told me all these stories about how this one town, everybody in the town is a pizza delivery heroin guy. I was just stunned by all of this to Columbus, and I thought to myself, this is an amazing story. But of course, the question was always, why then would they have a market in West Virginia, of all places? That also made no sense. And these questions sent me on a trek, the result of which is my book, which is right here. Hold on. Dreamland. Yikes. Anyway. This guy, and so tonight what I would like to tell you is simply a bit about this book and what Levi's, 501s, and Walmart, and Rebar, and shoelaces all have to do with the tale of heroin and pill addiction, which now in our country is nationwide. This guy told me the story of these fellas. He told me that they were all from the small town. A lot of these families migrated to the San Fernando Valley in L.A. A few of them knew how to cook black tar heroin from the opium. Opium poppy grows very nicely in the mountains of Mexico in Nayarit, and the Indians have been growing it there for about 100 years or so. Chinese brought it across 100 years or so. A few families figured out how to make black tar heroin and began selling it in parks in San Fernando Valley. Excuse me. When they did that, after a while, people got onto it. People from the village began selling more, and it became saturated. The police got onto it at the same time, began making arrests at the same time. The Latino street gangs in Los Angeles began taxing all the drug dealers in their areas. This business model that, believe me, still exists all across LA today, where if you're a drug dealer, you have to pay a little tribute to the gang in your area. These guys from Jalisco decide that they are going to switch up, and they get into cars. That's when they begin to get into cars and begin to drive, and they get a larger clientele. This is the time of beepers and pagers and stuff like that. A larger clientele, but at the same time, they avoid the cops, and they avoid competition with each other. In time, they begin to expand farther. More saturation, more people coming up, getting into the business. Remember, they're all from the same town. They can't kill each other. They're not using guns. They know where each other's mothers live. So they can't do that. They have to get market share by whatever any capitalist enterprise does when profits drop, and that's move on. And they begin to move on. They move first to San Diego, Pomona, Ontario, Reno, Portland, Honolulu, and each of those steps along the way is fueled by an enormous reservoir of labor back in Nayarit. I always wondered why it was that they could continually pull people into this into this profession, into this job, while so many of their friends, all these friends are getting arrested. Some are doing 5, 10, 15 years in prison, and still people back home would be raising their hand, I'll do it. I'll do it. Began to figure that out as time went on. They're after all, I realized that these guys were not cartel killers. They were guys in dead-end jobs. They were bakers, avocado growers, sugarcane farmers, construction workers. All around them were guys selling heroin who had trucks, who had nice houses. One of the things that acted as a recruiting vehicle was rebar. All across Mexico, you go all across immigrant Mexico, and you will see the kind of the skyline immigrant Mexico involves rebar sticking up out of the houses. That's because people here work here, landscaping, restaurant work, factory work, whatever. They send their money home. They build houses piecemeal over many years, one room at a time. Whenever they have a savings, they send money home, have another room built, or they build it themselves. When they're done with the first floor, they say, I'm going to be returning home, and I'm going to build a second story. The promise to that, is they put up the rebar. So all across immigrant villages in Mexico, you see rebar. Everywhere you go. It's amazing. It's one of the first things I began to know. And when I visited Jalisco, Nayarit, one of the things I realized was there is no rebar in Jalisco, Nayarit. It's because heroin has taken the level of accomplishment up a whole level. So in order for you to have arrived, heroin allows you to build that house in 9 months instead of 9 years. And you're no longer cool and marriageable property as a man if you are building a house over 9 years with rebar sticking out of it. Girls don't like that. So all of a sudden, building a house like this is the only way to go, and that's why a lot of guys show up and raise their hands. The other thing that I realized, the reason they had huge amounts of labor that they could continually draw on to fund the expansion of this system as it went across the United States through the 1990s, was that they had figured out that this system was a perfect system for transforming cheap hits of black tar heroin, which cost them about 50 cents a piece, into stacks of gleaming Levi's 501 jeans. Levi's 501 jeans in those years, in the 90s, I know, I was living there, was the gold standard of rural Mexican menswear. You wore them and you were presumed to have arrived. You wore them out on Friday night. They were so much better, so much more expensive, too, than the cheap Mexican jeans. Well, they figured out that this system could turn the heroin into jeans because the addicts would be willing to steal anything, and you could give them lists. And after a while, they realized that they could go in and clean out JCPenney's or Sears or Target of all their jeans, and pretty soon they began giving them lists. Long lists of all the jeans that they wanted, and what sizes, what colors, all that kind of stuff. And they'd take it home, and they'd hand them out, these jeans out like Santa Claus back in Nayarit. Pretty soon they were like it was really like the coming of Santa Claus. Oh, so-and-so's coming home, he's bringing gifts, giving it away. Pretty soon, if you didn't have Levi's 501 jeans, no girl would talk to you. So the system spread. This system spread, and this, remember, was a time when there was not a growing population of addicts across the country. The system spread. They could not arrest. The cops would arrest them and arrest them and arrest them, and still more guys would come. But one of the things that they began to learn, because this was a time when there was no expansion of this was the early 90s, mid 90s, of the opiate addict population, they had to learn how to market. They couldn't kill each other. There would be 2 or 3 crews, say, in Salt Lake or in Denver, or 4 or 5 crews in Portland, a big hub for those guys. They couldn't kill each other. How do they do it? They market. They begin to offer discounts. Come-ons. You bring me 3 new clients, I'll give you 10 free balloons. You buy every day, one hit for me a day, I'll give you a free one on Sunday. They learned marketing and customer service and come-ons because there was a finite, a non-expanding population of addicts, and they became a master marketers. They did not use guns. They used marketing, classic capitalist marketing that we really have perfected here in the United States. But I still, even as I got to know this, I began to realize I still don't know why. Okay, they go to go to all these towns, and they start in San Fernando Valley. They go to Reno, all these different places. But why is there a appetite for heroin in West Virginia? I could not figure this out. And remember, I was in Mexico during the 90s. I didn't know the crucial part of the next part of this story. And the truth is that the Jalisco boys, these kids from Nayarit, would only be kind of like this interesting little story, kind of a footnote almost, had it not been also for a revolution in medicine that was taking place exactly at the time when I was in Mexico. Like most revolutions, this took place for good reason and good intentions. For many years, doctors had never prescribed opiate painkillers for any reason, fearing that people would be addicted, even to people who were dying of cancer and in agonizing pain. They still would say, no, I'm sorry, he'll be addicted. Well, what's the problem if he's if he's only got 3 months, 6 months to live, he'll be dead. Why do we care if he's addicted? Why not care more about the quality of life? And this was the attitude of a bunch of young doctors who grew up in the 1980s and were, I believe, personally and emotionally seared by this experience. They saw that as doctors, their job was to alleviate pain, and they saw medicine was not providing this medicine to people to alleviate that pain. And they began to question why that was. They gained a kind of a collective conscience. They were all over the country, but they kind of began to come together at conferences and so on and understand that this was inhumane, what was happening. And they began to kind of develop a feeling of like a revolutionary kind of attitude towards medicine, that this needed to change, and we should do anything we can to defeat it, to break it down, to use these crucial tools that are essential for the quality of life of people, particularly at first people dying of cancer. And so a revolutionary fervor did emerge. They won that argument about whether or not it should be used for cancer pain and that kind of thing, and terminal pain. That was an easy one to win, but they kept on pushing. And what was crucial to this was that revolutionary fervor, because like many revolutionaries, the end justified the means. They had no evidence for what they began to propose, which was these pills are virtually non-addictive when used to treat pain. That was the claim that they made. They didn't have much nuance with that. They didn't say some people and other people might have problems. They said this is virtually non-addictive. Less than 1%, that was the other phrase they used, less than 1% of all the people on which is used to treat pain get addicted. And there was almost a religious crusade forming among these people. They were then joined, these doctors, they were then joined by pharmaceutical companies that at that point, beginning in the late 80s, but really in the 1990s, were developing new pain tools that involved opiates. At the same time, there were other kind of societal changes happening in America that I thought were extraordinarily important in all this. That don't involve so much these fellows, but just involve changes in medicine. One was that the idea was that we were a country, suffering from an epidemic of pain. There was pain untreated all across the country, and again, there was some truth to that. But the crusade pushed, and finally people began to say, no, we need to make sure all doctors are treating pain first and foremost. It should be one of their first considerations. So let's make pain the fifth vital sign. This happened in about the mid-1990s. Medical institutions, very important medical institutions, began to propose the idea that pain was a vital sign, like pulse and whatnot, and respiratory system. The problem is, of course, you cannot measure pain objectively. You cannot say that day in, day out, measure it the way you can say a pulse. It's extraordinarily subjective, depends on every person, in fact, depends on the person's time of day sometimes. At the same time, almost a revolution in the way patients and doctors related was underway. There was a patient rights movement that had really grown up really in the aftermath of the Nuremberg trials and in the 60s, but it really was gaining its power in the 1990s. And at that point, Ideas like pain is what the patient says it is emerged in medicine. Now, that's probably not a bad idea, except for that it also is a complete rationale for doctor shopping, as people found out later. There was a patient rights movement that developed as well. Doctor evaluation. So now doctors were being evaluated according to how well they treated the pain. Well, oftentimes, as pain pills became far more liberally prescribed, this meant how liberally does the doctor give me a prescription for pain pills. At the same time, I believe, this is my feeling, that this coincided with a feeling in the United States that we were entitled to a life without pain. We had won the Cold War. We kind of wanted to kick back. The life was complicated. We wanted simplicity. We wanted easy solutions. We had spent 50 years fighting the Soviets, and now that was done. And there was this feeling like we were the kings. We had done it. Capitalism had won, and weren't we entitled to a life without pain? There was also, I believe, a kind of a fear, together with that, a kind of a fear of pain. And at the same time, there was this attitude of our bodies were kind of like cars, and we demanded that the doctor fix us. And by the way, we were not going to participate much in our own wellness. We were not going to do the tough stuff that the doctor probably should have suggested, like running or stopping, don't eat so many Doritos, cut back on soda, stop smoking, et cetera, et cetera. No, that's too hard. The pill was easier. Insurance companies began cutting back on a variety of services that were used to treat pain before that, and left doctors with one tool, and that was opiate painkillers. In 1996, of course, the game changer of them all, OxyContin was released by the company Purdue Pharma, a private company in Connecticut, using many of the ideas that had been developed by the pain specialists, which was they promoted and marketed OxyContin, saying it was virtually non-addictive, that it was there was a lot of reasons for this, a lot of specious science, a lot of studies that they called studies that were not. But they basically came up with a marketing plan to convince doctors. It was not aimed at us. It was aimed at doctors to convince them that if they prescribed this, that it was virtually risk-free. Less than 1% of all people get addicted to this, doc. When the drug is used to treat pain. There was no evidence for this. They later recognized, in fact, the leading spokesperson recognized that we just wanted people to break down those barriers to prescribing. We didn't really have any evidence that this was non-addictive. And in time, Purdue ran with that idea, developed an entire promotional campaign that the DEA said was the first time an opiate has been marketed as if it was an over-the-counter drug, basically. And so they had phone pads, message pads, they had hats, fishing hats, they had trips to Scottsdale, they had continuing medical education seminars funded by Purdue and brought in some of these pain specialists to say, yes, these drugs are really important to use, we need to use them. They had a CD, it was called Swing in the Right Direction with OxyContin. And it was with a bunch of Woody Herman and Count Basie tunes. They give them out to all the doctors. And in time, this was also, by the way, a time of the pharmaceutical company sales force arms race. So every company was hiring more and more sales reps. In 93, 94, roughly, it was about 35,000 sales reps, pharmaceutical sales reps in the United States. In 2003, there was 120,000. The market, the business model was hire as many people, blast them at the doctors, have them be visited 2, 3, 4, 5 times sometimes, and tell them the same thing over and over. And in time, marketing worked. Guess what? It worked. Doctors began prescribing this aggressively and in large quantities, and a revolution was accomplished in really a record time, 10 years, and it was done. And pretty soon, doctors were prescribing these pills, Vicodin, Percocet, these OxyContin, for wisdom tooth extraction, sports injuries, chronic pain, post-surgery. Over and over, they were prescribing them all. At the same time, they were prescribing huge quantities. That was key. It wasn't enough to say, you have a appendix operation, as I had, and here's 5 Vicodin to tide you over. Here's 10 Vicodin. No, 60 Vicodin, always. It was just massive prescribing of supply. And one of the first places they targeted with this massive marketing campaign was, of course, Appalachia. In southern Ohio, eastern Kentucky, West Virginia, etc. And one town in particular where I spent a lot of time for this book was the town of Portsmouth. Portsmouth is a good deal of distance from here, but in many ways it is right around the corner, I think. Portsmouth was an all-American town, chosen an all-American town in 1979, 1980. It was the town where they held the first NFL night game. Many, many years ago, they had a team that later morphed into the Detroit Lions. They had, steel factories, shoe factories, a bustling main street. 50,000 people lived in town, and at the center of the town was this glorious, enormous football field-sized swimming pool, where life itself almost took place. Everybody in the town used the pool as its babysitter. You drop the kids off at 9, go to work, pick them up at 5. People grew up at this pool. They ate fries. People still remember the Coppertone and the French fries. The pool never stopped growing. The guy who owned it owned a shoe factory. He didn't need the money from the pool. He reinvested the money in the pool, and he bought more and more land, and it began to grow. There was baseball field and picnic and basketball, all these different things at this beautiful. It was a very egalitarian place where everybody in the swimming, everybody looked the same in a pair of swimming trunks, right? It was an amazing center, soul-giving, kind of life-giving force in this town, and life itself revolved around. So if you were a toddler, you were in the shallow end. By 7th grade, you were in the middle end. High school, you were jumping off the diving board. By your young adulthood, you were losing your virginity out in the extended fields outside the pool, and your kids then went over to the toddler, and the cycle began itself. It's true, happened. And the name of this pool was Dreamland. In 1980, the steel mill closed. Shoe factories have been leaving slowly. With the steel factory, a lot left after that. A lot of people had to leave. Main Street began to empty out. And in 1993, the town kind of complicit, the city fathers kind of complicit with the developer, allowed Dreamland to be dug up. And it was plowed under, and it is now on Highway 52. You can see it. It is now a big sea of asphalt and a strip mall with an O'Reilly's Auto Parts store. With that, the town lost its immune system, social immune system, in my opinion. And over the next few years, opiates crept in, part of this pain revolution that was being heavily promoted. And within 5 years, Portsmouth, Ohio had developed the pill mill and became the pill mill, really the pill mill capital of the country for a while. A dozen pill mills in a town of 20,000 people. For a while, it was about the only locally owned business that ever started in Portsmouth. Long lines, you know the story. Long lines, people in their pajamas, people fighting over places in line. So many pills were prescribed that in Portsmouth, Ohio, you had literally an OxyContin economy. You could buy anything with pills. They were perfect currency. They didn't dissolve really very easily. They had markings. You could tell how much they were worth. 10 milligrams, 15, 20, 40, whatever it was. The central banks were the pill mills that kept regulating the money supply. And crucial to all this was that you could buy anything, virtually anything you needed to live with pills for about 10 years or so in Portsmouth, Ohio. T-bone steaks, Xboxes, cable service, dental appointments, cars, refrigerator. You could buy it all if you had enough pills. People would rob people in their houses. They would leave the cash to take the pills. Central to all this, in my opinion, was the store Walmart. Walmart had replaced Dreamland as the social center. It was the only place, in fact, where you actually could see other people. After Dreamland closed, the town kind of closed in on itself. People went indoors. They didn't go out into the street. Crime rose. It became very forbidding. The public sphere became very forbidding. The only place you really saw people was at Walmart. That was the place where you said hello. Walmart, though, was crucial. I have a theory. I tested it, but this is my theory, so you kind of have to hear it, which is to say that this thing spread out of what is basically ground zero, which is Columbus, Cincinnati, West Virginia, Eastern Kentucky, because there was not a local economic, a diverse economic ecosystem to defeat it. That had addicts tried to steal their daily nut from all these different locally owned stores, they'd have to go to store to store to store, and at each place the owner would be ready for them, waiting, because they were defending their store. Walmart had greeters paid $9 an hour who didn't care. Also, by then, you could steal anything you needed at Walmart. So your dealer would say, well, it's August, my children need school clothes. You go steal school clothes and a buzzsaw. It regulated the prices. Walmart regulated the prices of the OxyContin economy. So if you brought in a buzzsaw to your dealer, he would call up Walmart. Didn't know what the price was, Black & Decker buzzsaw. How much is that? Oh, well, sir, we sell them for $80, $79.99, and he'd give you half of that in pills, relying on Walmart's pricing to figure it out. As all this was going on, as the pain revolution was sweeping across America, but started in that area just described first, the Jalisco boys from Nayarit make their way across the Mississippi River for the first time, and I chart this. This happened on June 11th of 1998. Guy I know, interviewed extensively, and I'm very clear on his importance in this story. Brought it east. He's first to Indianapolis for about a day or two. Had a big hurricane there. Tornado. You guys have tornadoes out here. I'm really bad at hurricane. A hurricane. That's good. A tornado, which I've never seen but don't want to. I'd rather have like 3 or 4 earthquakes to every tornado from what I've seen on TV. A tornado swept through Indianapolis the day he got there, and he says, he would be like me, just like moved on to Dayton, didn't like Dayton, moved on to Columbus. And he hit Columbus right at the very moment. By coincidence, there's no conspiracy theory here, just pure coincidence, hit Columbus right at the very time when Purdue Pharma is massively marketing OxyContin, where doctors all across the country are arguing for a very aggressive approach to pain management through opiate pain pills. He figures out, little by little, by talking to addicts themselves, that he has hit upon a gold mine. He goes to Wheeling, West Virginia. An addict there tries to trade him. You give me your black tar heroin, I'll give you this bottle of OxyContin. He looked at the bottle, he didn't know what OxyContin was. And the woman, also a heroin addict, explains to him. He was impressed because she is the only heroin addict, he told me, that he'd ever seen who had a new car and a house. And she had already developed the business of buying the pills from seniors and going up to the Appalachian Mountains and selling them for triple. She said, these pills are just like heroin, and if you follow this market, you will make $1 million. That's the way it works in the underworld. Just little tips here and there, and it clues him in. So he stays in Columbus. He gets a few kids from Jalisco. They begin to work it for a year. They go back home. At first he tries to lie to all his compatriots. He tells them, oh, you know, I'm in New York or something like that, because he wants to market off himself. But for a year that lasts, and then his kids go back home. They tell everybody about Columbus, Ohio, and Columbus, Ohio has had heroin since that day, since that time, massive amounts of it. Together, excuse me. The reason I want to start, the reason I tell the story of the Jalisco boys is not because they're the only heroin traffickers in America, not because they're the only Mexican black tar heroin traffickers in America. They are not either one of those. There's many, but they are they're the vanguard, I think, of a new kind of drug trafficking that does not use guns, does not use kind of the Scarface way, the Colombian way, this Bloods and Crips way. They use capitalism. They use marketing, far more insidious, far more effective. But they are also, their importance to this story is that they are the first ones to recognize and systematically exploit, coming with this unbeatable business model and unquenchable, huge labor pool. They were the first ones to recognize and systematically exploit the coming heroin market that is implied by the massive prescribing and addiction to pain pills all across this area where we're sitting right now. They hit the ground just as the pain revolution is taking hold. Purdue Pharma was promoting OxyContin as virtually non-addictive, and the drug to start with and stay with. That was almost exactly what the Jalisco boys would tell their addict customers. So that was my answer. The answer to how black tar heroin came to Huntington, West Virginia, was that they came to Columbus, and guys from Huntington who were addicted to pills figured out that they could get heroin for about the third the price they were paying for the pills. They would go up, buy the heroin from the Mexican guys, and bring it back to Huntington. And after a while, people couldn't. The addicts down there couldn't handle it. It was just too powerful, and they began to die. But as I was fully involved in this story, I began to realize that it was now not just that area. It was spreading to the rest of the country, and I began to realize that wherever there were pills, massively prescribed without really caring or paying attention to whom you were prescribing to, nor what quantity, that wherever they were doing this, and this was all over the country, that there was going to be heroin before too long. It started in areas we as a country are used to overlooking, like Appalachia, kind of our canaries and our societal coal mines, but it very quickly had spread to the wealthiest suburbs. Places like North Carolina, Wisconsin, Tennessee, Oregon. The strange thing was children of the people who benefited most from our economic run-ups of since the mid-1990s were getting hooked on drugs used, of all things, to numb pain. I began to feel it was more than just pharmaceutical advertising that got us to this point. I started the book thinking I was writing a crime book, a drug book. And instead it became more about who we had become as Americans, what we had become as a country. I believe that part of the reason for this happening is that we have spent the last 35 years destroying a community in America, mocking and clawing at the girdings of government that provide the public assets and the infrastructure that we took for granted and that make communal public life possible. Meanwhile, we exalted the private sector. We beat communism, and we came to believe that the free market was some kind of, I believe, infallible God. Accepting this economic dogma, then, we allowed high priests of finance and Wall Street and so on to develop gimmicks to send our jobs, particularly manufacturing jobs, overseas, and thus, in the process, crushing many communities, particularly in this area. We began also, I think, what was also happening was we began to believe that old rules don't apply to us. Remember, this was a period where we began to believe that home run hitters could hit 60-plus home runs every year, and many of them could do it all at once at the same time, when in fact it had only been done twice in all the history of baseball. We began to believe that mortgage-backed, that you accumulate a bunch of really bad, awful home loans, and Standard & Poor's puts a AAA rating on it, and all of a sudden they become good loans. And we began to believe that massive fire hose-like prescribing of opiate pain pills to the entire population, we could do that without running any risk at all. We demanded perfection from government and forgave the private sector its trespasses. Ronald Reagan said, "Government is the problem." This story is frankly about government outgunned. It's really about the private sector run amok. One of the interesting things that I found as I began to get into this was I began to realize that the only people fighting this were people who received a government paycheck. They were coroners, they were public health nurses, DEA, cops, prosecutors, EMS, county health and county drug counselors. Profits, this is a classic story, if you ask me, of a corporate welfare, where all the profits accrue to the private sector, a few companies, and the entire cost of dealing with all this, the collateral damage, the nightmarish collateral damage nationwide fell to the private sector, to jails, to county hospitals, et cetera, et cetera. It's corporate welfare, it seemed to me, in its most extreme form. The family that owns Purdue Pharma, the Sackler family you may have seen in Forbes, is now considered one of the wealthiest families in all of America, estimated worth of $14 billion, due entirely to $35 billion in OxyContin sales since 1996. But the more I dug, the more I tried to research this, the more I realized there was all these different threads. It wasn't quite. It was a complicated story. At the same time, we kind of developed an obsessive fear of the public sphere, being outside. Parents hovering over their kids, afraid they'll feel pain, afraid they'll fail, keeping them from the consequences of their failure. Atlantic Monthly wrote a story I loved a few months ago talking about kids who grew up in the era of hyperprotection from physical pain were now demanding to be protected from painful ideas as well. They were demanding professors provide trigger warnings. I certainly hope no student at NKU asks for a trigger warning before a class. That's why you're in college, right? Demand difficult ideas and how to address them. They were demanding trigger warnings in advance of ideas that might provoke strong emotional content, a novel, or something that describes, say, racial violence or something of that nature. Psychology Today ran a story on the declining student resilience that noticed increased neediness in college students, blaming teachers for poor grades and, end quote, increasingly seeking help for, and apparently having emotional crises over problems of everyday life. As a country, meanwhile, seems to me that we acted as if consumption was the path, and the accumulation of stuff was the path to happiness. We built isolation into our suburbs and called it prosperity. We added to that mix an expansion of technology that allows us to be friends with people across the country and really ignorant of the people who live across the street from us. We pretend nowadays that we're informed by 24-hour cable news, which in my opinion are simply dealers in the drug of outrage. They provide little information, mostly heat, alarm, frenzy, frantic fear, and an isolation that separates us from each other and envelops us in a luxurious warmth of outrage that feels so good. I believe we should turn off 24-hour news and really get informed. 24-hour news, in my opinion, is just like heroin. Just as addicts get together, one of the warning signs that a kid is on heroin is that he begins to find only time for kids who are also in new friends and they're all on drugs. Talking with and spending time with no one who isn't like them. So 24-hour news has done the same to us, molding us into little bubbles of people who believe and talk and think exactly alike. I just happy to say that I turned down my first interview with CNN the other day, a few weeks ago, because I felt that the interview was 5 minutes long with a host that didn't know anything about the topic, and I was going to be asked questions like, what do we do? Answer that in 25 seconds. And so I said, yeah, thanks, no, I'm not going to do that. We wound up dangerously, my feeling is that over these last decades, we have wound up dangerously separate from each other, whether in a poor town or a wealthy town. We have become, in my opinion, just like Portsmouth after Dreamland closed. We lack those kind of fundamental communal forums that bring us together. Kids no longer play in the street. Parks are underused. Dreamland lies buried beneath a strip mall. Why then do we wonder that heroin is everywhere? Our very search for painlessness led us to it. Heroin, in my opinion, is the final expression of values we have fostered for 35 years. Heroin turns every addict into a narcissistic, self-absorbed, solitary hyper-consumer. A life that finds opiates turns away from family and community and devotes itself entirely to self-gratification by buying and consuming one product, the drug that most makes being alone not just all right, but preferable. Every addict, one of the things I learned talking with addicts for this book was that every addict, or most of them, use their private bedrooms. Those bedrooms that parents want to seclude them in because outside is too dangerous and they'll fail, or outside there's child molesters behind every tree. Those private bedrooms are where kids are now hiding their dope, shooting up their dope, and dying. Isolation is heroin's natural habitat. There are experiments that demonstrate this, I think, that are fascinating. There's the one experiment with the rat in the cage with nothing in the cage except for him and a bottle of heroin-laced water, and of course the rat just hits on that water until he overdoses and dies. And another scientist came along years later and designed an experiment where he built a big cage, enormous cage with lots of rats and lots of things to do, and wheels and tunnels and all this great stuff, and several rats, 5, 6 rats at a time, and a bottle of heroin-laced water, and the rats didn't even touch it. Seems to me, my feeling is that if you want to keep your kids off heroin, make sure people in your neighborhood do things together in public often. Break down those barriers that keep people isolated. Create your own dreamland on your block. The interesting thing is, in my opinion, heroin is fearsome enough, apparently, to make us do that, in some cases at least. One of them, I think, is right here in northern Kentucky, what you all are trying to do, bringing together a variety of groups from all over to address this and leverage the brain power and the energy of people from all over this region. It seems to me that in some areas what heroin does to users, their families, and their neighborhoods is so harrowing that heroin reminds those of us who lived through it of the ties that bind us to each other, producing in some places the opposite effect that it does in users. And anyway, that's what I'd like to think. But the place I saw it was the town where I least expected to find it, and that was in Portsmouth, Ohio, the town that had led us into this, a Rust Belt beat-down town that everyone was leaving and having no faith in, is the place where I found hope. I'd like to say before I tell this story of Portsmouth that this is an un-American epidemic, in my opinion. I've lived in Mexico, and I know what America means to poor people across the world. This epidemic reflects and is rooted in changes away from who we are at our best. The American ideal is self-reliance, determining our own lives, control of our own lives. This is what inspires immigrants. In fact, it is what every Jalisco boy is all about. He doesn't want to work for a cartel. He wants to go and do his own thing, and he happens to be selling a deadly product. But the point is that he finds control of his own life in the United States. It's a beautiful idea. Opiate addiction, of course, is the opposite. An opiate addict relinquishes free will, enslaved to the pursuit of painlessness, of comfort. This is a story, I think, this whole story is about the agony that results from the pursuit of painlessness. And a solution, one of the solutions, I don't talk about a solution, I talk about many solutions, is that all of us need to take accountability for our own health and wellness. I know it's hard. So much works against us, doesn't it? Community is hard. It's easier to keep alone in your house, inventing reasons why it's dangerous to be outside. Recovery is hard. Easier to keep inventing reasons why isolation is preferable. But all this is why I love the story of Portsmouth, Ohio. When I went to Portsmouth the first time, I saw a town that I'd never seen a town like that, honestly. Abandoned buildings, rent-to-owns, check cashing places, hookers by the railroad track. It was the first glance, and I was stunned that a town in America could look this way. It was also, as I got to know it a little bit, I realized it was a town where a lot of people bought into the dogma of dependence. They bought into Wall Street's idea that this was a financial service economy now, and any place that made stuff, well, that was kind of like yesterday's story. And they bought that idea, you know. But what I began to find as I returned again and again over a period of maybe 9 months to Portsmouth, Ohio, 6 times I went back, was that at the same time that all of that was true, there was also, at the same time, a culture of recovery growing. And it was a beautiful thing to watch, and one that you had to dig into the town to really find, because it was not going to hit you in the face the first couple of times you went there. The place I saw it first had nothing to do with heroin. It was the shoelace manufacturer. There was the largest shoelace manufacturer in America in Portsmouth, Ohio, as part of all those shoe factories. It had 120,000 shoelaces, pairs of shoelaces it produced in its heyday. it had trouble with competition and so on, and it reduced, but it's still hanging tough until the story that I heard was the family that owned it, the third generation kind of bought it, and the third, or began to run it. The third generation is the generation that prefers to play golf all day, I guess, and they ran, eventually, whatever the case, the company ended up in bankruptcy, and at that very moment, it seemed to me that that was like the crucial point. Had they allowed that shoelace factory to go under and lose its, by then I think it was 40 employees or something like that, not a lot, but still, it was like, it would have been this dagger in the heart of the town of Portsmouth, Ohio. Instead, a group of small businessmen, an insurance salesman, a lawyer, a contractor, some others, pooled their money, bought the company, Mitchell Lace it was called, out of bankruptcy. They hired the managers, not the owners, they hired the managers of the company. And by the time I visited and heard this story, they were now back up to 60 employees, 80 employees. They were then exporting shoelaces to Taiwan, to Mexico, to Italy. It was part of what I saw as happening in this town. It was more than just getting away from drugs, which also happened. I'll talk about that in just a bit. They were remaking governance. For years, they figured, well, why have a city manager? We'll save money and we'll just have the mayor run the town. Well, the mayor doesn't know how to run a town. The mayor has another job. And so there was all this incompetence, recalls, backbiting, because the whole town, nobody knew when the trash was being picked up. There were basic things that were not happening. Finally, they hire a city manager a few years ago, and lo and behold, they begin to enact modern municipal governance. But I also found that in Portsmouth, Ohio, it was an amazing thing to watch. They had a whole new culture of recovery from addiction was taking place, along with this recovery from kind of dependence on forces outside your economic and municipal forces outside your control. The state of Ohio had, as you know, probably in 2011, had regulated pain pill mills, so you no longer could be a felon and own one. With that, the DEA came through and closed all those nasty pill mills in Portsmouth, Ohio. With that, an entire population had breathing space between it and dope. A very, very important thing to do. And in time, by the time I got there, a year or two later, a whole culture of recovery was growing in this beat-down, bedraggled town of Portsmouth, Ohio. 10%, in fact, of the town was in recovery for opiate addiction because they now had some space. They had people moving into downtown finally. They had buildings being renovated. It was like this, once the culture of dependence was kind of removed or sloughed off, everybody began to learn how to do it in a strange way. There were NA meetings every day in all parts of town. There was a real culture, a competing culture of recovery, competing with that culture of let's steal the copper wire and get high all day. A whole new crew of kids, of former addicts, were studying to be drug counselors. It was a rebirth that you had to dig to find, but eventually I found it. I was thrilled because I wanted to tell a true story, but I also wanted to tell a story that ended with hope. It seems to me that the way Portsmouth is showing accountability for its own socio-economic and municipal health, that we have to do with our own bodies and our own personal choices. That's part of the solution to this problem. We have to question the drugs marketed to us, and we have to wonder why the government allows all those pharma ads on TV all the time. We have to depend less on pills as solutions, demand our grocers stock better food. We have to work out. We have to get exercise. We have to stop demanding doctors do the impossible and magically fix our every problem. We have to participate in our own wellness. It will then, I bet, matter far less what new product a drug company or the drug underworld devises. I end the book this way, talking about Portsmouth, Ohio. So the battered old town had hung on. It was somehow a beacon, embracing shivering and hollowed-eyed junkies, letting them know that all was not lost, that at the bottom of the rubble was a place just like them, kicked and buried but surviving, a place that had, like them, shredded and lost so much that was precious, but was nurturing all that again. Though they were adrift, they too could begin to find their way back to that place called Dreamland. Thank you very much.
For those of you who will be sticking around, hello? Check. Are we still on? Okay. For those of you who will be sticking around for the discussion, of course, in your brochure that was handed out when you came in, your program, there's a list of everyone who's on the panel. Gives you a little bit of background as well. You want to pull that out? Wait 1 second here. Is this? All right. It is on. Okay. All right. The first question I think that maybe a lot of you might have, some of you may have more of a personal experience with this, but the first question to the panel today would be, is what we're seeing here in the tri-state equal to what you have read and what's been shown in the book Dreamland? Is it that bad? Is it more serious than what's depicted here? What have each of you seen in your own realm? Jason?
Thank you. I think the short answer is certainly yes. Inherently, as a person in recovery, we find comfort in isolation. So it's most difficult to reach out to ask for help when the opportunity arises. So that leads to the unnecessary death associated with this disease. Those that are too afraid to ask or too ashamed to ask for help. We're seeing changes in the disease of addiction where with alcohol or other drugs, you could survive, you could live to find recovery. But as you'll hear tonight, all too often, and as most of you know, that's just not the case. First time, second time, very likely to die of an overdose.
Eric?
Yes, I think that Sam's book resonates with me. I think that the problem is, I don't think it's getting better at this point. I think that we're making a lot of inroads in different areas, but I think that the overall effect is the same. And I think that especially some of the issues that were in his book resonated and were very true. The idea of a pizza delivery system. Our son Nicholas died in our home. His fatal overdose was delivered to our home just like a pizza. So, yeah, I do believe that much of what is in Sam's book is accurate.
Lynn?
You know, to be honest with you, I didn't even want to read this book. I felt like I have been living this for several years, as many of you have. But I think it was important to read it, and I'm very glad that I did, because I saw in many ways Northern Kentucky in the book, and people from Northern Kentucky in the book. But it also filled in the gaps and gave a sense of hope. And some of the things that I think have gotten better, although Northern Kentucky is pretty darn good at coming together to deal with issues. And I think we did that pretty early on. And that's important because we were all in silos. I can remember my introduction to this issue was I got a phone call from one of the treatment providers saying, hey, we're having this heroin problem. What I thought he said was, do you think you could fix it? I'm not really sure what he said. But, and my first thought was, you know, it's your side of the canoe that's leaking. I'm having all I can do to deal with my side of the canoe. But I quickly realized we're in the same canoe, and if we don't start talking together and working together and putting together a plan of how we as the community can work together to address that. And we're not there yet. And, you know, on the public health side of things, when I started looking at our hepatitis C rates several years ago and started watching them go up and finding out that we were seeing an increase because of IV drug use, in particular heroin, I knew that I had to talk to other people, not just the hospitals, but the advocates, the elected officials, and a whole host of other people in the community to try to build support for the public health tool that we need to address the infectious diseases that come with this epidemic. And we're not there yet. The rates continue to go up.
Perilou?
I come to this table as a researcher, as a scientist, as an instructor, a college professor here. And I've been teaching a course in drug policy since 1999. And I never thought that the things that I had been teaching in that course would ever be needed locally. I thought it was mostly about, hey, look, kids, here's what the rest of the world does, and here's what the U.S. does, and, you know, let's contrast that and see what we might do differently. And then this blew up. And I think one thing that is progress is the way the community has reached out to people like me and people from all walks of life to bring what we can to this problem. So for me, that's about scientific evidence. I want to bring that evidence to the table and say we should use that evidence. So, for example, I see progress in the fact that Senate Bill 192 actually made syringe access exchange programs legal in Kentucky for the first time. And yet, despite all the evidence for them, we still don't have one here in northern Kentucky. We're, well, Grant County, but not right here in our immediate 3 counties. We still resist medication-assisted treatment. It's the most effective treatment for opioid use disorder, and yet somehow it's not real recovery. And we still really stigmatize people with the disease of addiction. We still look at it as a choice and not a disease.
You mentioned the needle exchange program. Let's talk about that for a moment, just because, you know, we have done a number of stories of area parks, not only in Kentucky, but over in Ohio, and you know, kids are out there on the swing set or what have you, and parents who are out there are finding handfuls of syringes and needles that have been used. When you talk about a needle exchange program, and there were some rumblings when that was brought up, and that's why I wanted to touch on it. Some people think that, well, why would you just give people needles so they can just continue to use? That could be one argument on that side. But that's not the focus of a needle exchange program. It's to control those needles from being out randomly in the community, and there's a lot of safety, I guess, measures you could say that go into that. Kind of explain why you support that needle exchange program. Perilou?
Lynn, oh, okay.
Start
Yeah.
and I'll
all
jump
right.
in.
Yeah, no problem. Well, I support syringe access exchange programs because science. That's it. That's what I do, okay? And syringe access exchange programs are not a new idea. They have been around for 30 years. They have been studied in countries all over the world. And consistently across all these studies, it is shown that having syringe access exchange programs reduces the spread of disease. It improves community safety because instead of these syringes being just randomly discarded, people are given sharps containers to dispose of them safely. They actually help people get into treatment because guess what? When you treat people like human beings and reach out to them and don't say, "Go away, you scum," instead, "Come here, we want to help you." Oddly enough, science says when you treat people like human beings, they act like human beings. And so they respond to that. They're more likely to get into treatment. Tag team.
Yeah, everything Perry Lou says is so true. I mean, the evidence is very clear in communities across this nation who have implemented effective needle exchange programs. You know, the folks that use the programs don't want to get infected. We know the science tells us that addiction or substance use disorder is a chronic disease. And so when you are going through treatment and lifelong recovery, the last thing you need is to have a hepatitis C infection that needs treatment or a lifelong infection of HIV. And here in Northern Kentucky, we have the high hepatitis C rates. We don't yet have the epidemic of HIV, but that's why we're working so hard to try to get these programs in place, because we don't want the HIV epidemic. These are expensive infections to have to treat. And interestingly enough, some of the folks who become infected are on Medicaid or on Medicare or have private insurance. And so paying for care gets very expensive. We as a community, we as taxpayers, we as employers cannot afford to have an HIV epidemic on top of the hepatitis C that we have. Now, for some folks, that's a great argument. They understand the cost, the $600,000 lifetime cost, the cost for liver transplants, those kinds of things. But for other people, as Perry Lou was saying, it's about stopping the stigma, providing a connection to health care that can be an entree to a whole host of other services. For some people who have a substance use disorder, their only connection to the healthcare system might be the emergency room when they come in as an overdose. And we've got to change that dynamic, and we've got to connect people to the services and the care that they deserve.
Earlier, I had you raise your hand, and there were so many people that raised their hand when I said you have a direct connection to heroin. Has heroin impacted yourself, your family, somebody you know close to you? And there were a lot of hands that went up. And Nicholas died from an overdose. And Eric, you and your wife Holly had to live through that. And if I can again, how many in here have lost a loved one or family member to heroin overdose? So you share the same experience here. And oftentimes when we go out and we do stories with family members, there is that one line that comes out and says, "Not our family. I didn't suspect anything. There wasn't anything that stood out. You know, my son or my daughter, a star athlete. This couldn't happen to them, but it did." What do you say about a response to that, and then kind of along the lines of the stigma that's out there?
Well, you know, we used to think that. I used to think that. It could never happen to us. And about the last thing that we ever expected to happen was for our son to become a heroin addict. And I remember the phone call that we got informing us of what happened. He had been stopped, a traffic stop in Hamilton County, and he had they did a search of his vehicle and found paraphernalia, and we had gotten a call from the Justice Center in Hamilton County telling us that they were holding him, and I said, well, what for, and what kind of drug paraphernalia? We were devastated. I was devastated. And my son had become one of those people. Those people that I used to think lived under bridges, lived out of their cars, that would do anything to get their next fix. And Nicholas had become one of those people. And but you know what? Those people are our people. Those people are our sons, our daughters. Those people are our loved ones, our families. And if you don't believe it, come to our 5K and look at the memorial wall. And look at all the faces on that wall from one side to the other that are young faces. They're beautiful people. These are people, cheerleaders, football, sports, that we've lost to heroin. And also, try wearing this logo into a restaurant. If you don't believe it, see how far you get before somebody says something to you to the effect of, we're happy for what you're doing, I'm in recovery, or my family has a problem. It's all over. Tell me it can't happen to you. It can happen to anyone.
Let's talk about, Jason, you were a heroin addict, now former, and heroin had a control of your life, and that's something that you fortunately have walked away from now, and you are helping other people. Let's talk about that a little bit, and kind of from your perspective, moving forward, how difficult is it? I think it's easy for some folks who maybe watch our newscasts, read the paper, see the headlines, and they go, just stop. Just stop. It's not that easy. Talk about your challenge.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Craig. I'm one of the lucky ones. And not just because I get to work with people like Eric, Dr. Goddard, and Dr. Sadler, and Sam, but because I'm in recovery. I made it. I lived through this. And because I get to bring you what Sam eloquently illustrated in the closing remarks of his book, a message of hope. That people recover given the opportunity, and that we all deserve treatment. We all deserve help. And sometimes we go on to do some pretty amazing things given the chance. That's why in Kenton County, at the detention center, we opened up a new treatment facility, treatment program that offers help to those that seemingly would be at the end of their rope. They get arrested, they get stigmatized, they end up in jail. Well, now they can get help in jail. It was only through compassion, understanding, education that I was given the opportunity to get treatment. A friend of mine, a loved one, who I thought would turn her back on me, did exactly the opposite. When I admitted to her, finally, I came out of my shell and said, look, I've got a problem, and I don't know what to do. She came to me and offered me help. She said to me, Jason, come down from there and get the help you deserve. And those three words, the help that you deserve, that's what broke down the wall for me. That's what broke down the barrier to treatment, to recovery. So whatever the case may be, understand that if you're dealing with someone in active addiction, you're dealing with a very sick person. And there are symptoms to this disease, and they're not common. They're not like a cold or the flu or diabetes or any other disease. They're unique to the disease. So if you are dealing with someone suffering, you owe it to them to understand the disease that they suffer from and treat them accordingly.
Sam, if I can, in your book you make a parallel between the big marketing campaigns that the pharmaceutical companies did, and then, interestingly enough, the marketing campaign that the dealers did to push their product. What can society do? What can government agencies do? What can grassroots efforts like Northern Kentucky Hates Heroin, so many of these grassroots groups that pop up because family members have been impacted? What kind of a marketing campaign can we launch that can fight their marketing campaign?
Yeah, it's really hard. The largest lobby in D.C. is pharmaceutical lobby. It's like government for the drug industry almost sometimes. It makes me feel. I really don't, as I said in my talk, I see no logical reason why we should have so many, we should have drug ads on TV. To me, that feels loony, kind of almost like why. I just don't see it, the reason for it. I think, I mean, I think there is politicians. I've been a reporter a long time, and I actually happen to love politicians. I know it's not popular to say that. Popular politicians work really damn hard. I've seen a lot of them, and I've seen one scoundrel, and everybody else has been hard working, right? You may not agree with them, that's another thing, but I mean, to me, there's a lot of good people in politics one thing I also think is that people in politics do listen, at least at this level, the state level, particularly a state that's not enormous like California and Kentucky, you know. They do listen to people who come together and don't stop, you know, that they come together and push and don't stop, and don't think that, oh well, you know, fall into that old. It's really a kind of almost. I've been a reporter, as I said, a long time. I kind of view the attitude, well, we tried and they didn't do anything, so screw them. They're just a bunch of unhearing, you know, careless politicians. Don't care at all. I think you just have to not stop, you know, and I think it needs to be very clear goals. The ones that work, the campaigns that work, have very clear goals. We want this to happen, boom, boom, boom. And to me, I think you have a lot of power in this community to do that. You have people with lots of skills, marketing skills. I would say that if you stop, then you just defeat yourself. But I really do believe, I've been seen this in action in various places, not just in California, where you make your voice known and you don't stop, and you are heard. Now, DC is another animal, and I don't understand it very well, and I've never really covered it. So, but locally, I understand it, and I believe that there are roles that, you know, to begin to draw attention, for example, just to the outrageous amounts of TV ads that these guys put on all hours of the day, you know, that kind of thing. That, to me, feels like an objective that is worth expending some political capital and some organization. I think, for example, I've spent some time in Jason's center there at the Unit 104 in the Kenton County Jail. I think that is definitely worth fighting for in all counties. My God, it's you know, here's the thing. We've talked a lot about how it's a cliche, right? Now, almost. We can't arrest our way out of this. Okay, I believe that. I totally agree with that. I've been a reporter since the crack years, when basically in the crack years, I don't remember anybody arguing for treatment. You know, jail and prison, and that's it. It's another time, another context, but if you're going to say we can't arrest our way out of it, then the response is, well, we need more treatment. Yeah, well, where are those beds going to come from? And tomorrow, not 5 years, 10 years from now, because those things cost a lot of political capital and money and energy to site and build and then staff properly according to regulations and so on. So where is that going to come from? And to my way of thinking, perhaps jail. We just have to think differently about how to do jail, to think of it as an investment. And right now, we've thought of it for 100 years. Everybody thinks of it. Every other country, I'm sure, thinks of it as a fixed cost. Well, we just accept it as, we just warehouse these folks, and okay, it's just a part of being in a democratic society, free society. People screw up, and that's where we put them. But how about if you think of it in terms of, well, instead of them sitting around just arguing over what TV station to watch and learning how to cook methamphetamine better, why don't you provide a learning, a productive experience, not with the expectation that everyone will be miraculously helped and go on to, no, but to say that this is a bet that is a better bet on with all the money we spend on jail to that we will have a better outcome overall, and have those expectations be realistic and not exaggerated. Mm-hmm. But to me, those are things that your community, I don't live here, so it's not my thing, but those are things community can come together and work towards concrete things all across the state.
Let's talk a little bit. Back in the 80s, of course, you had This Is Your Brain on Drugs, The Egg in the Frying Pan. Everybody who's a certain age, I won't throw that age out there, but knows that campaign, obviously. You had the DARE program that rolled out all across the country, and now these kids get T-shirts and pencils and graduate with a certificate. Is that an old way to beat this particular issue? And what needs to change? Jason?
That represents, to me, I think, like that's the cookie-cutter description of addiction. Very vague, very inaccurate. This is a very complex issue, as you all know, and with equally complex solutions. The solution is more treatment. The solution is syringe access and exchange. The solution is a shift in culture, away from drug glorification, away from the disease and dysfunction, into more of a center of well-being, of health and wellness. That's what Northern Kentucky is poised to do. If this area is anything, it is community-based. I mean, we are a strong community. We come together in crisis, and we make things happen. We change laws, we raise money, and we make it happen here. I'm very proud to say that. I came here a transplant from California, and I have never seen a community come together to address a crisis better than I have here in Northern Kentucky. Yeah.
Doctor, you look like you're poised to really speak up here.
Jumping in here. You know, and I'm sure many of you have heard this before, people don't, as particularly young people, don't just wake up one morning and say, I think I'll try heroin. There are things that lead up to that, and I know Sam had alluded to some of the issues around emotional pain, mental anguish, as well as physical pain. And, you know, I think that as part of coming at the prevention angle is really looking at what leads young people to start down that pathway where maybe it's cigarettes and alcohol and pot and other things that ultimately lead to now I'm taking somebody's opiate painkillers, or I got 60 of them from my doctor for a knee injury, and now I'm hooked, and it's cheaper and easier for me now to move to heroin. Whatever that pathway is, you know, we have multiple opportunities to intercede all along the way. And I know Sam alludes to something that in the book that I have said from day one is, you know, part of the reason we got to where we are is because we don't have the infrastructure in place for supporting mental health or substance use disorders. We've got bits and pieces and parts, but we don't have that strong infrastructure that could have prevented maybe this from happening, and still needs to be put in place, because today it's heroin, but we know people are injecting other drugs as well, and other drugs are going to happen. And so we need to put things in place to address the issue we've got, knowing full well that it's got to also help us with preventing epidemics of other kinds of drugs as well.
Dr. Goddard?
Yeah, with regard to prevention, I think prevention, the research that we have on this, and again, back to science, sorry, that's what I do, but it starts before the cigarettes. It starts before the alcohol. It starts with adverse childhood experiences. The more, yeah. And this is it's a technical term, but the more adverse childhood experiences a given person has had in his or her life, the greater is that person's risk for developing drug addiction. And it's a dose-response relationship. It's the more you get, the more your risk is. Here are some of those adverse childhood experiences. The loss of a parent through death, divorce, or incarceration. How many kids are growing up today with one, at least one, sometimes both parents incarcerated? Also, childhood trauma. So the emotional, the physical abuse and neglect. Those are things that we can help prevent. Can we prevent them completely? No. But these are things that start way before DARE, that start way before we worry about gateway drugs, and instead start with having healthy communities, providing mental health care, substance use disorder care for the parents. If you have a parent who's mentally ill or has a substance use disorder, the deck is stacked against you. These are things that contribute to addiction being a disease, and these are things that figure into that very first use. People say, well, it's still a choice, right? They still chose to use that first time, but that the risk that a given person faces after that very first use is largely determined by things outside of their control. So their genes, their adverse childhood experiences, the other sources of reinforcers they have in their life. Sam was talking about the Rat Park study, which I have taught to a couple of generations of students. It's true. It is true that anyone can develop a substance use disorder if they use drugs often enough. But the risk of substance use disorders is not randomly distributed in our communities. It is higher among people who have fewer other things to look forward to in their lives. So it's no accident that Portsmouth, at its nadir, was devastated by heroin. Right. It's exactly. I mean, that's
what I thought the pool represented, was this kind of stripping away of the societal immune system to the virus of drug addiction. It struck me that it was completely vulnerable, not unlike Indians and smallpox when the Europeans came over. Kind of.
Yep. Absolutely. So my point really is, let's not spend so much time blaming and shaming, and instead let's look at what we can do to reach out, to reduce stigma, to use evidence-based approaches to treatment instead of saying, well, that worked for me, so I'm pretty sure that's the only thing that's going to work for anybody. Let's actually look at the science and help build programs that could really make a difference.
Eric, you wanted to chime in?
Yeah, Craig, I want to echo a lot of what is just said here. There's all kinds of trauma. We hear about sports injuries and work-related injuries and opiate addiction from painkillers. Nicholas We learned about 3 years before he passed, actually, that when he was very little, about 6 years old, had suffered multiple molestations. And I believed in my core that was at the foot of it explains virtually everything that happened in his life with regard to addiction. That's not to say that someone who can't be using recreationally or whatever and become addicted, but where else do you go with the idea that someone gets clean, they're in recovery, they go into rehab, they've been out for a good period of time, and it's the cliche, time after time, that's when you're most vulnerable for relapse. And it's because you haven't learned how to deal with that issue. One of the things that you need to do if you are going to hopefully have a successful recovery is figure out what took you there to begin with. Mm-hmm. What brought me to addiction to begin with? And I believe that it's more often than not, it's some sort of a core issue that you may not have any knowledge of whatsoever, but it's been there for a long time.
Let's talk about Narcan and Vivitrol and Suboxone, items that are out there now. Narcan, obviously, again, in the headlines a lot being used, sheriff's deputies, paramedics. I'm sure Jason has one really close. He usually carries one in his car as well. These are becoming almost commonplace in our first aid kits. Is enough being done by the pharmaceutical companies that make these products to engineer and come up with better products to combat the fight, and what should be the next step? And is it a one drug fits all? Is Vivitrol, is that the perfect one? Suboxone, kind of give some insight on that.
You know, one of the first things that happened when Narcan became a household name was that the drug companies tripled the price. So the dramatic price increase was followed by a lack of, we couldn't afford it. So the grassroots organizations that were buying it to give out for free could no longer afford it, or very limited amounts of it, and people continue to die because of it. So,
do you currently take Vivitrol, or is there anything that you do now in recovery? Is there anything that you take?
I don't take any medication for my recovery, no. That's not to say that it wouldn't have been appropriate for me, or maybe not be appropriate for me in the future. Mm-hmm. What worked for me, and this is just for me, it was 13 months and 1 day of residential abstinence-based treatment. Mm-hmm. And that was dictated by my need, a client-based need, not by an insurance company, not by, it was what I needed. Right. It was personalized for me, the personalized care that I needed. It wasn't the 28-day program mm-hmm. that I tried and failed at. It was 13 months and 1 day.
Congratulations, by the way.
Thanks.
Eric, was Nicholas on anything throughout his time?
No, I wish that we had been more familiar with his disease. I wish that we had a better background and understanding of what the options were. And part of what our group has done is to make those options more available and more well-known. Mm-hmm. If quite likely, I like to think at least that if we had Narcan available that night, things would have been different. As it was, we didn't really even know what it was, and certainly it was not available to us easily. I believe that medically assisted treatment is something that is very, I wholeheartedly support it. I think depending on what the position of the person in recovery, what his or her position is on it, is how resistant they are to the whole idea. I believe that as long as you are actively using, you are no mindset whatsoever to be able to make any kind of a logical or good decision for yourself. And so if in a moment of hope they have had enough, and I believe that medically assisted treatment is terrific.
Dr.
At
Sadler.
least for a period of time.
And Eric, in Eric's case, in Nicholas's case, he had been through treatment, and his
Yes.
tolerance had shifted. His tolerance had lowered.
Yeah.
Had he been on Vivitrol when he had left treatment, he would have had that level of protection that could have prevented that relapse that led to an overdose.
And Dr. Seiler, explain,
Thank you.
how many people know what Vivitrol is? Okay, so.
A well-educated group.
Yes.
But, something that has come up here, we have talked about how complex this is, and the various kinds of treatment that are available do need to be tailored to that individual. Just like with other chronic diseases, everybody's not on the same blood pressure medicine. Everybody's not on the same medicine for high blood sugar with their diabetes. And there are other components that go with it, different behavior changes, and things of that nature. And I think one of the biggest things, regardless of which path is most appropriate for someone, I think it's important for those of us around someone who's going through treatment and recovery is to remember that this is not an acute disease. It's not like when you get bronchitis and you're put on an antibiotic for maybe a couple weeks and you get better and you go on with your life. So often I hear people say, well, they've been through rehab 4 times and it just isn't working. And folks need to understand that it's chronic, this is lifelong, and people need to have the combination of treatments and supports that is unique to them and their situation over the span of their lifetime.
Dr. Goddard?
Absolutely. We should not have a one-size-fits-all treatment. This is not a one-size-fits-all disease. People who use drugs like heroin deserve the same range of evidence-based treatments that a person who has high blood pressure or type 2 diabetes deserves. It's not just one thing. The evidence says medication-assisted treatment is the most effective, but the medication, it's not that you take the medication and that fixes you like you take penicillin and it fixes your strep throat. The medication in medication-assisted treatment is helping correct the imbalance, the injury that happens to the brain as a function of addiction. But it's the behavioral part. It's learning to reestablish contact. It's learning to reach out to other people for help. It's not just, I take medication every day. That's just one part of it. The same as if you had type 2 diabetes, you might take something that helped with your insulin use or helped your blood sugar balance, or maybe you'd even need insulin. But that's not all. You have to watch what you eat. You have to monitor your blood sugar. There are multiple components to it. So it's not one size fits all, but we definitely need to know about what the evidence says about effective treatment.
What I just want to say one thing. What we're all collectively describing here is a new trend in treatment. It's called it's a model called the biopsychosocial spiritual model of treating addiction. And biologically, we treat a disease, a chronic, progressive, potentially fatal disease, with a medication that is proven to stabilize an individual. The psycho part is a behavioral modification, a cognitive behavioral therapy, evidence-based therapies that work to address those core issues that maybe brought that person to the door of addiction. And then the social aspect is the support that someone needs in recovery, the support, how we reduce the stigma, the discrimination often associated with this disease. And then lastly, spiritually, we need that sense of community. We need to build that faith in order to sustain a long journey into and through recovery. So it's a biopsychosocial model of treatment.
Dr. Seiler, when you're looking at Northern Kentucky Hates Heroin groups and other grassroots efforts throughout the area, if they weren't here, could the county and state do this job in trying to help people, or does it take grassroots groups to raise the money during 5Ks like you have one coming up and all of these events where basically the community is helping themselves to solve this problem. What could you do without these groups?
We would not be where we are today if it weren't for the advocates. They have been such a strong arm in this effort. We would not have the state law that we have. We would not have made as much progress as we have made in addressing the stigma, helping people understand this is a disease. We would not be as far as we are with the needle exchange or syringe access exchange programs if it weren't for the advocates standing side by side with me and my staff and St. Elizabeth to tell their stories of why this is necessary. So they are absolutely a key part of our effort in Northern Kentucky.
And unfortunately, we are coming up to the 9 o'clock hour. The conversation will continue, but Sam, do you have any final thoughts?
I was going to say a couple of things. In response to that last question, I'm sure that groups like Northern Kentucky Hates Heroin are important in all this. But the other important thing to note is that you wouldn't want for the county to do it all itself. I mean, this is a story about isolation or community. We tried one approach to pain, which was a bunch of pills blasted at the country without any rhyme or reason or nuance as to who was getting them and how much. Medicine, very siloed. It's about parents spending really years, all alone, thinking they were all alone. And that model leads nowhere. It creates problems. All problems seem insoluble when you are fragmented. And so the county, maybe the county could have done some of this stuff, but you wouldn't want that. You want the county to come together with community groups and parent groups and all this stuff so that there is that leverage. You're finding new solutions when you bring people together. That's one of the most important lessons, I think, out of this that I take away from this whole story is that when we find solutions when we come together. Heroin wants you to be alone, wants the county to do it all. It's that kind of thing. It's a isolating drug, man, and it's just so tough. And one last thing on medically assisted treatment. Probably when I started this book, if I had thought about that concept, which I did not because I didn't know anything about it, I probably would have said, well, that doesn't sound like a good idea to separate, to treat one drug with another. But I kind of have changed my mind on that. One reason is that you need to understand that all our heroin is coming from Mexico now. And what that means is that supply is more plentiful, it's more potent, and it's cheaper. And that means that when you are an addict in recovery and you get out, and plus, the Sinaloa cartel is now fully involved. I wrote about these guys with this business model that recognized this system, this issue, and this market that was developing. But those guys now are only one of many people, drug traffickers out of Mexico, who have switched production and dealers on the street who have gone from selling cocaine to heroin. And so it's so prevalent that you get out, and I fear for kids getting out, particularly if they only have 28 days or 6 months. I think that's way too little now. But remember that we no longer have heroin coming from Burma and Turkey. That does not happen. It does not come from Afghanistan. If it did, it would be the weakest heroin, and you would almost have no problem with it because it would be cut and cut and cut. This is heroin coming right from Mexico, cut very little. It's extraordinarily potent. It's cheaper than it's ever been. And this is another reason, I think, why these reasons that you've heard explained are extraordinarily important. But another is that you have a whole new context in the heroin world in the United States today that is nothing like we've ever known, nothing like there's heroin movies from the 1970s I was referring to. This is a whole level of prevalence, potency, and cheap and affordability, if I want to put it that way, that we have not faced as a country. And that's a whole new. We need to really keep that in mind as we design some of these approaches.
The old approaches don't work anymore. We have to change them.
I don't believe that, a lot of people did die of overdoses in the 1970s, but I think probably as many really died of dirty needles from during the AIDS epidemic. Now we're seeing, as Jason said, people get out and bam, it's like I've met addicts from the 1960s who are still alive. You can survive. Not a very pleasant life, it's kind of an enslaved life, but nevertheless, you can survive. There are people around who have. The problem is now that those folks were dealing with heroin was expensive, really weak cut, diluted. And
now it's more potent, laced with fentanyl.
Now yes, right. It's like completely unforgiving. And so I think you need to keep that in mind as well when you're designing approaches to all this problem.
All right. I want to thank everyone for, of course, coming tonight. The conversation does continue. A couple notes for you here. If you'd like to hear more from Sam, he will be back on campus, by the way, for an open forum tomorrow at 4 p.m. in the University Center, room 135. He's also going to be talking with students in KU's honors program, but there's ample room for others to attend, so if you want to hear more, please, you can go and attend that. If you'd like to reflect on what you've heard here this evening, stay in your seats until the rest of the audience is exited, for those who do want to leave. You can then move down closer to the center section of the stage here. The conversation will continue. Colette Thompson from NKU's Scripps Howard Center for Civic Engagement will facilitate that reflection for you. Sam, by the way, is also going to be outside in the hallway signing more copies of Dreamland, which NKU's Barnes & Noble campus bookstore will also be offering for sale in hardback and paperback versions. The paperback is scheduled for official release tomorrow, in fact. Some of the NKU student exhibits are outside in the hallway, so please go visit those as well. Tonight's event, by the way, will be online for viewing at nku.edu. For information on that, you can click there. I've also, of course, had the opportunity to meet a number of great people that are in our community that are fighting this fight each and every day, and I thank each and every one of you for sharing both personal experiences and the science of things. Also, 5K. Yes, let's talk about this. If you'd like to take part in the Northern Kentucky Hates Heroin 5K event coming up, go to nkyhatesheroin.com. Is that correct? Okay. Yep. The 5K is coming up on June 11th, Saturday, June 11th. So sign up and take part in that and continue the conversation as well. On behalf of President Mearns and NKU, thank you all, of course, for coming and caring so much about this story and this situation in our community. If you would like to reach out to me at all on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram, it's at McKee, WCPO. I'd love to hear from you if you have anything going on in your community, organizations, events, story ideas, anything about this topic. I grew up in a home full of drugs. I survived that, and I want to make sure that we continue a positive story in this community and solve this problem. Thank you.